Welcome to Subject to Power. I'm El Kemahira. I'm a documentary producer and writer, and on this show, I have in-depth conversations with people from science, law, economy, culture, history, from all around the world about the various means and the systems that shape women's lives. In this episode, we'll be talking about one of patriarchy's most powerful and enduring tools to control women, a tool that's been used to keep women out of power and away from agency for millennia. And that is economic exclusion. Now, economic exclusion of women is a very big, sprawling subject, but my guest in this episode is very, very good at taking super complex concepts and all this macro information and translating it into a very clear and fascinating picture. Professor and author Linda Scott is an internationally renowned expert on women's economic development, and she works with multinational corporations, international agencies, governments, and NGOs, designing and testing programs to better include women in the world economy, especially through entrepreneurship. Linda is also an award-winning teacher and lecturer, formerly at University of Oxford and University of Illinois, and now she's a visiting professor at Brown University, where she teaches gender, women, and enterprise. Linda is perhaps best known for creating the concept of the double X economy, which reveals how women have been economically subjugated across the world and throughout history. With the double X economy, Linda demonstrates through extensive data and on-the-ground research how women have been systematically excluded from the entire financial system, which goes far beyond being denied paid work or being exploited for unpaid labor. In this hour, we kind of go everywhere all at once, talking about the far-reaching consequences of shutting women out. We also talk about the equally far-reaching positive impacts of lifting the constraints on women. We talk about our chimp bonobo deep past and our very dark present, and also the exciting new project Linda has in the works. Thank you for coming on the show to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate your time, and I'm interested to know, I know that the double X economy is the culmination, if that's fair to say, of years and years, a huge body of economic research. And I'd love for you to sort of talk a little bit about some of what the work that went into that, both the concept and the analysis of the double X economy.
Sure. It started really with my previous book. I had written a book on the history of sort of the modern economy in America and American feminism and their interaction, in particular beauty and fashion, which were actually the first industries in this country, but people don't know that because, of course, they don't. And but it's because, we learned that the important things were things like railroads and stuff, when actually the main thing for many years was textiles. So, because that's girl stuff, right? So we don't get taught that part.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common pattern. So anyway, what I saw in that research was something very different from what was sort of the consensus, still is, I think, the consensus in feminist thinking. And that was that the modern market or capitalist economy had even been the source of women's oppression. Some people still think that. And I wasn't seeing that. I was seeing it was a book that had a lot of primary research involved, just like Double X Economy. And what I was seeing was exactly the opposite, that women were being empowered by the participation that came to them through that economy, and that was part of what fed the feminist movement. So just after that book was published, I went to Oxford and I thought to myself, okay, I have a different platform. I have a different sphere I can work in here. And what I would like to do is see whether or not what I saw in the American economy, whether those same practices could be applied to women in developing countries and have the same effect.
Uh-huh.
So I started putting in for grants with the British government, actually, on various projects that were designed to do that. And as I went through, I wanted to have, and this is where you come directly to the double X economy, I wanted to have a 360-degree view of economics. I didn't just want paid and unpaid labor. I wanted to look at markets, at spending, at charity, at investment, everything. And so that's what I started to do, was to do these projects that not only were designed to look at the empowerment of women, but also to do it in every economic domain.
Mm.
About the same time, data sets started coming out with economic numbers for women, which was new. And I started keeping up with those very closely and saw that on the groundwork, I was seeing that when you aggregate it, you could see how it added up to the patterns at the national and global level. So I ended up calling that the double X economy because the patterns were very similar. They were global. They touched every part of the economy. And we were finding that, yes, if you lifted the constraints on women's economic participation, it did lift them up. So that's it.
Yeah, thank you for being so concise with that. I know there's so much more to that. But, I have to say, like, reading it, one, it kind of rewired my brain in some fundamental ways, just like opening up like ways of thinking that I just hadn't before. And the other thing is that the double X economy as a concept fills one, as a woman, with dread on the one hand and hope on the other, in a sense, because you're talking about this as a shadow economy. But at the same time, you're also giving instruction on like what needs to happen. And you have one great line that says, it's not that the rich nations could afford to set their women free, but that setting the women free made them rich.
Exactly.
And that absolutely blew my mind because that says it. So I wanted to dig in a little bit more to why it is that we say that gender inequality is such a bad economic strategy and gender equality is literally a recipe for success.
Full stop. Yeah.
Full stop. Yeah.
Full stop. Yeah. So it starts with this discovery that really was first, I think, pointed out by the World Economic Forum of the correlation between female labor force participation and economic growth in GDP. And they actually were the first ones in a little bit more backhanded way than I said it, to say that this was a causal relationship. It has proven out to be causal, but at the time, people just said, oh, these things we don't know what the relationship is between them. And eventually it proved out with 164 different countries to have a direct relationship, a causal relationship. And so you could see then that there was a benefit. You could rank the countries by gender equality, all the countries by gender equality, and what you would have at the top would be wealthy, stable, healthy, educated countries, Scandinavia being at the very top. And at the bottom, you would have war-torn, impoverished countries. And anybody could tell that just from looking at the list, So then people started doing various forms of analysis. There was a lot of data collection that had to happen. People hadn't collected data on women. And then doing these studies like I was doing, where we went out in the field and just tried things to see what would help.
Mm.
And what we found was that the results were just remarkable, that you would open up just something like credit to women, so microfinance, and the benefits to whole communities would just be amazing. Now, so there's sort of the implicit, well, if you grow when you include women in labor force participation, that must mean that when you exclude them, it's bad economics, right? And certainly that seems quite true. But also over time, it became clearer and clearer, at least to me and some of my closest colleagues, that the reason we had these benefits coming was because we were getting rid of practices that were harmful.
Mm.
And they were harmful in a lot of ways, but they were, because this was what we were looking at, harmful economically. So it's not just magical, we get benefits from this. It's even before that, you've got harmful practices that hold countries back.
Right. Not just it's women, but there's a whole waterfall of effects of that.
Yes. Yeah. And the ones that are, I think, are the most, probably the most direct one is that people don't realize that domestic violence costs nations about 5% of GDP all over the world. That's a huge number. And you can't quantify the pain and the suffering, obviously, but you can quantify the visit to the emergency room, the police car driving up to the house, the therapy that has to, property damage. You can calculate all of that. And wow, it's a big number.
Yeah. And what's amazing is how low down on the sort of list of priorities for economically speaking that this item is. It's like it's just an accepted fact of life that we pay the price for, we've decided as a society, essentially. But I wanted to, about like kind of setting the record straight on women's workforce participation. I think you say somewhere in the beginning of the book that women flowing into the workforce in the 70s, when it happened en masse, is actually why we're why we're the economic superpowers that we are. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that truly also blew my mind.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't pull that through to the conclusion when I said, it's this economic growth machine that's been proven out. I say that just because it's not unique to any one country nor to any group of countries. But of the countries, particularly the Western democracies, who were the earliest to kind of open up women's access, you saw this quite consistently. And what happens is that, and it did seem counterintuitive at the time, but we now know it's got several reasons that happens. One of them is it just expands the labor supply. You just increase your capacity by 2 times, right?
Right.
Anytime you have twice the factory space, you can do twice as much, right? So there's that. But there's also a talent allocation that becomes much more efficient and creative. And in particular, by the time this was happening, the women in those countries a lot of them were well educated, but they were being made to stay at home. Well, that's a waste. All right. And so when you include them, then you increase your productivity, right? And then there are other things like, for example, the follow-on effects on children and the way dual income households have more money and therefore spend it rather differently in a more productive way. We now know that mixed gender teams and businesses produce better results. And so all of these things had to be discovered, right? But at this point, it's pretty well a given that this is a thing.
And also, like conversely, like if you were to send women back home, which there is a concerted effort to do at this point, then what would happen to the economy?
Yeah, well, this is it. I'm telling this to anybody who will stand still long enough to listen at this point. These people are crazy. Somebody needs to disabuse them of the notion that they want this. Because at this point, again, the Western democracies, but it's pretty true around the world. In the Western democracies, you've got you've got 50%, some countries like the US, a little bit more, of the labor force is now female. And they produce about 40% of GDP. All right. Now, first of all, just right there, the arithmetic, you can say if all those women left their jobs overnight, there would not be enough men to fill them. And certainly they would not be appropriately trained to fill them, even if there were. Also, you'd just lose half your economy, half your tax base, half your household income. It would be Armageddon. It would be scorched earth. I mean, somebody needs to tell these guys that they simply can't do it. If they get control of the government, the economists are just going to tell them no. I mean, they just can't. They can't.
It's too late.
It's too late. Yes. From a purely economic perspective, never mind a social perspective, but from a purely economic perspective, you just don't get to go there. You just don't.
Right. And they don't have the capacity or the knowledge to understand what an absolute catastrophe that would be for them.
Well, this is one of the problems is that this kind of thinking is not based on fact. It's based on wishful thinking and grievance politics. And
Yeah.
over and over, I see people claiming things that just simply do not have any evidence for them. A couple of other things that are important to know is that if women left the workforce, you would also see a huge disruption in supply chains because they're
Sure.
all over throughout the supply chains of everything. So there'd just be stuff you couldn't get. The other thing that I think is really important for people to realize is that women are concentrated in essential jobs. So your hospitals would not open the doors if women went back home, for instance. So it would just have huge effects. No can do. You just can't.
Yeah. We're too far down the track. Yeah.
And they need to do their research.
So one of the other aspects to the double X economy, it really zooms out and takes such a long view and such a pattern recognition view of kind of mapping how these things work together. And what struck me a great deal was like how systematized this is across the globe. And I don't want to sound like all men are evil, sort of conspiratorial, but like how long men have collaborated and conspired against women as a whole to create this double X economy. And I wanted to kind of dig into the particular ways in which women are excluded from economies.
I think one thing that would help is to tweak what we're calling the double X economy is just as a kind of a note, is that the distinctive things about the women's economy, the things that would distinguish them from the underground economy or the gig economy, are all a function of exclusionary practices. They do what they do because they were excluded from other things. Okay. That's one reason why you remove the exclusions, then things sort of explode in a good way. I think the overall thing that particularly people in the West, kind of the short-sightedness is that they focus a lot on wage labor. And by that, I mean just paid labor and unpaid labor in the home. And they don't think much beyond that. When in fact, what it is that women have been for thousands of years excluded from the money system entirely. So it's things like not letting them have bank accounts, not letting them own land, not letting them invest money, not letting them have cash even, not letting them make consumer decisions. It's just basically, again, 360 degrees around exclusion from the money system. And these are done through things like inheritance laws, for instance,
Sure.
requirements that banks stipulate on account holders, things like that.
And also, you write quite a bit about like you need resources to be in business in the
Yeah.
economy. And so equipment, labor unions.
That's right. Labor unions, market cooperatives, guilds have all traditionally, and many still do, exclude women. And so there's a kind of a network block there, in addition to, for example, a financial block where you're not allowed to get the equipment that you need because you can't get the capital to get it, right? Or the credit to get it. So there's all of that. There's also kind of a group dynamic that goes on with the men. And this maybe is where the labor unions should be mentioned, but it happens, and the marketing boards and stuff, where there's kind of a locking of elbows. It's a coalitionary thing. And then what goes along with that is a feeling that it's okay to cheat the women. So they end up, if they're in business, they get worse terms from their customers, they get worse terms from their suppliers. And as a consequence, it's much harder for them to succeed in a business. And this is why it's very important to understand this is every part of the economy and not just your job.
Right. And also, it may look different in different countries, but it's a global thing.
It's a global thing. And I got to tell you, when you've been around to enough countries doing this work, it starts to look the same everywhere. And at first, when I was seeing that, I'd get off the plane and start talking to people and just think, this is so monotonous, so horribly monotonous, like it's the same. And this is another thing that has been only possible recently is because of the data and the ability to travel more widely. Because before, people didn't share data as easily, and there weren't that many venues in which you could go to more than one country. Anthropologists usually are only funded for one place 1 or 2 times, right? And so the
Yeah.
ability to make the comparisons has not been there.
Yeah. So it's only now that you've been able to get eyes on so many different cultures and so many different practices. Yeah.
That's right. And people just get sidetracked by the fact that the religion is different or the clothing is different or the food is different or whatever, because underneath it all, the economics is never different. I'm telling you, it's a matter of degree, not a matter of substance.
Yeah. There are also other things like which I think is so important, the blocked communication or blocked information, blocked from having information they need.
Yes. The top of mind for me on that is equal pay. I mean, one of the reasons why women have a hard time pursuing an equal pay claim is they don't have enough reliable information to know what the men are being paid, for instance. Technology definitely is one of the things that gets barred.
Yeah.
Technological information, that's definitely a big one.
Yeah.
And it happens everywhere from high tech to small farm holders in rural Africa. It happens again. It's just a different place, a different costume. That's it.
Yeah. Where there's almost this like invisible agreement between men that women don't get to take part in this.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why it's taken us such a long time to find this and discover this, and it's still, as you well know, it's not much recognized, is because the men just have a blind spot because they think it can't be important.
Yeah.
It can't be big enough to be important. It's trivial. So I think that they just don't think about it very much.
Yeah, you talk about going to these economic forums and trying to raise the issue of it and being brutally dismissed.
Yeah. That was one of that story that I told in the book is one of the worst moments, even now, one of the worst moments in my career.
Can you tell it quickly?
Sure. I was on this kind of a advisory board from a really big foundation. What it was that they'd selected economists from all over the world. There were, I think, 8 or 9 of us maybe from different countries everywhere. And we would meet in a different city every 6 months. And our charge was to figure out how to have a more inclusive economy. I mean, right off the bat, there was a problem because our way of thinking about economics, neoclassical economics, doesn't even have a way to think about inclusion because they can't think about exclusion. I mean, it's not a thing. They can talk about income inequality, but not exclusion. And that's what women have been, and a lot of other groups. I mean, African Americans in the United States suffered exclusion under Jim Crow, not just inequality.
Yeah, of course.
So, and you can think of lots of other groups.
Yeah.
But anyway, I have been appointed by the head of this foundation, actually, and specifically to do the gender thing. He had been very much convinced that the gender thing was the thing to be looking at. And of course, half the population, if you can't include them, that is definitely a need for an inclusive economy. You need to be looking at it. But I got in there and they were almost all men, and they just did not want to hear about it. And I was on there, I think, about 2 years. And every time I would say, here's what I could present at the next meeting so that you guys could learn about the gender thing. And they would always shut me down. And no matter how I tried to sort of interject into their discussions and presentations, it just kind of didn't work right because they were all from different countries. And every time they would present for a country, I would have the same thing to say, which is, well, the women in this country are excluded in XYZ ways. And of course, you can say that for every place. So it just wasn't happening. And so finally, my last meeting, I'd been doing some work with the G20, and I wanted to share that with the group because I thought it was kind of an interesting PBS kind of a topic. I thought it would be current events for them or something and not something they would take offense at. And so I offered to talk about it over lunch, so I wasn't taking anybody's time up. And so we're sitting at this table at lunch, and I sort of go, oh, I could tell you about this. And I was trying to be all kinds of perky so that nobody would be offended, because that's what women do. And The response was incredible. The guy who sat next to me, who was German, and he had always been pretty prickly about me being there at all. And I could feel him. He just got icy. And he said to me, why should the G20 be worried about women? They have countries to think about. And I said, half of their citizens in every one of those countries are women. And he just rolled his eyes. He just rolled his eyes. And then I got in a tango with, and I didn't mean this guy kind of jumped on me from China, said, well, the women belong at home. They should take care of the children and let the men provide. Well, of course, the problem with this, as you know, is that the men don't provide all that well, actually, on a global.
They don't.
And we do know now that the best thing for a child is for the mother to have some money. Yeah. And he didn't want to hear it. And then what was the other one? It was this guy from Singapore started to tell me, I said something about waste of education, I think, at that point. And the guy from Singapore says, well, the women in Singapore only go to college to find a husband.
Oh, so infuriating.
And I knew this at the time, and it's one of those, I wish I'd said this, is that actually the marriage rates in Singapore have been going in the toilet for decades. I mean, those women don't get married, so it was crazy. Anyway, finally, I just kind of hung it up and was so upset. I mean, it was in Singapore. It was a long flight. And I was just practically crying the whole way. I was so distressed. And I argued with myself all the way whether I should just quit and protest, and decided that no, everybody on the ground was working really hard for this, and it was my job to try to make these guys listen. But when I got back, they fired me. Or not fired me, but didn't invite me back. I mean, they just did not want to know. And this is at the global level. This is some of the most important economists in the world. Yeah.
What strikes me about that too is that you're here, like you're a woman, you're speaking your piece, and all you're doing is like scratching the surface, and then all these biases and these patriarchal ideals explode into the open.
And it's the same old tired excuses. The most I could get in any one meeting was just like one little thing about women's education or something. And once you've read The Double X Economy, you can see what you have to see is the whole pattern and the extended reach of it. And I never got a chance.
Yeah. Wow. It's truly amazing. Like it makes you feel a little bit hopeless. If you have a seat at the table, but you're not heard. So you have a line in the book about women's exclusion, especially of information and resources and this like male network. You say something along the lines of like, well, if you've been shut up on the farm or the house for literally thousands of years, as women, we're not just going to walk out the house and be like, oh, so, let's run this business.
Right. I mean, you don't have the knowledge and you don't have the capital, but you don't have the networks, and networks are really crucial in entrepreneurship. But you can't exactly as you're saying, they've been cooped up. And when I made that comment, I was talking about rural women in Papua New Guinea. They're not going to know, people who can help them with fulfillment.
Not being able to access or plug into a sort of sisterhood or a business network, like it just doesn't matter what your ideas are if you can't. Yeah.
Right. And of course, unfortunately, the sisterhood has its limits. And that's kind of the point of the old term of the double X economy, is that even though we're having some pretty good success spreading ourselves across the economy, it's still very limited. And so the likelihood of having a sister that had what you needed. Although one of the things that I really have come to appreciate is that sisterhood really is one of the answers to this problem, is that solidarity matters.
Yeah. I forget what chapter you say it in, but that we need a sisterhood to stand up to the brotherhood.
Right. And we know this even from primate behavior, right? I mean, this is the way you do it. And the strides that women have made over the last 75 years or longer have been the result of the first organized women's movements in history. And one of the reasons you haven't had as many before is that women were kept isolated from each other.
Yeah.
So, and you can kind of see why that might have happened,
you talk about another, and this is another portion of the book that is a bit devastating to read, when you're talking about the systematic starvation and deprivation of women and children. And we're not talking about theoretical, you are talking very concretely how you know this and how it manifests in different countries, or whatever you want to say about that.
Yeah. Okay. So, a really common practice in the developing world is a practice that gets shorthanded as last and least, that the women are fed last and least. And they get fed whatever is left over. The men get to eat whatever they want, and then the boys, and then the females. And what that means is that sometimes the mother goes without eating at all. And that's why when food is scarce, you will find the impact of malnutrition most on the females. And so this is one of the ways it can be measured. You can also look at teeth and other things to determine not so much the amount, but the composition of the diet, whether they got enough protein. They tend to be low on protein because the men don't share the meat. So food control is a big part of it. I actually have been working on this again lately, researching it, and lots happened since Double X Economy was published in the worlds of archaeology. And one of the things that's become clearer is how prevalent that has been for about as long as we have bones to look at. It's a thing.
Which kind of brings me into another area. I think some feminists and archaeologists among them, like feminist archaeologists, shouldn't say dream of, are trying to find our matriarchal past. And when I read your book, what I saw was a system of oppression, men over women, that have gone, maybe we have a matriarchal past. Maybe we do. Can we even tell? But you're shaking your head vigorously. When you say we're digging up past civilizations and you're seeing, malnourished women, that points to a system that's been in place for a very long time. I'm almost feeling like disabused of the idea that patriarchy goes back so much farther than we know.
Yeah, it does. It goes back to at least the beginning of agriculture. And it's not unique to agriculture, but it goes at least that far. And I only say at least because before that, we don't have written records. We have bones and things, DNA and things that you have to make inferences from. And increasingly, you can make more inferences from. It's old. It's probably as old as Homo sapiens, Well, not that old, not quite that old. There's new evidence to suggest, and I've just discovered this, that the deep past picture is a little bit better than I thought, but it's very old and it's universal. I would challenge anybody who thinks that some tribe or another was matriarchal or even egalitarian to look for two things. One is whether the males control organized violence, so armies, police, militias, raiding parties. And the other is whether or not the women are traded in marriage, especially without their consent. Okay. And if those two things are present, then I don't care what about the matrilineal or the matrilocality or any of the rest of it. That is a patriarchy. If those two things are there, you don't have anything like a matriarchy. And people have been looking earnestly for this since the 70s, because back in the day, we all thought, we got to find a matriarchy. Well, I'm as sad as anybody else, but people have been working for decades and nobody has found evidence of one.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I've covered this on this show. I've talked to Heide Abendroth and lots of scholars who point to the work of Maria Gimbutas and finding goddess figurines all over Europe, the site of Karahuyuk in Turkey that points to a matriarchal order of some kind. But that definition that you just gave of if there were, rape raids / trading women, then that's the definition of patriarchy.
Yeah, those two things are there. Sometimes I add the nutritional inequality too, but those are the two things I've come down to as being pretty much if you've got those, you don't. And the business about the goddesses and stuff, I mean, you try to test that a little bit. Just because the longest standing prime minister of the United Kingdom was Margaret Thatcher, does that mean that is not a patriarchy?
Yeah.
I mean, I lived there for 10 years, and I'm here to tell you it is still a patriarchy, okay?
Of course.
Just because a symbol of America is Columbia, is this not a patriarchy? Well, are you kidding me? So, I mean, those kinds of things are just so superficial, so non-indicative.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I'm sad. It makes me sad because I think in some sense, it's like a feminist nostalgia in a way, like fantasizing about how things could have been different and had we taken a different path or whatever.
Well, I think there is the case that we could have taken a different path. That seems, again, archaeologically clear that at one point something changed about maybe a little more than 10,000 years ago. And that fact and the fact that there is a lot of variability in history. There's patriarchy everywhere, but patriarchy is stronger and weaker in different places and at different times. And what that tells us is it's changeable. It's not biological, it's not inherited, it's not necessary, it's not nothing, and it can change. And so that to me gives a lot of hope. And actually, the kinds of things, honestly, if you can tell governments that they'd have more GDP if they let more women in the labor force, that's a real good argument.
Yeah.
I had a lot more hope at the time I wrote Double X Economy than I have now, though. Things are not good.
What is it that's giving you your pessimism, or what's taking away your hope at the moment? I mean, maybe it's obvious, but...
Well, so the first thing that I'm sure you've talked about and thought about and had people on the podcast to talk about is this manosphere thing. I think it has much more limited reach than people perhaps believe. And I think it is also much less accepted among males than people believe. But it is very destructive. And there's a pattern in the world since about 2008 of democracies collapsing at a rate we haven't seen before. And in every single instance, what you have is this grievance politics that gets whipped up by some hyper-masculine leader, all right, who is almost comically hyper-masculine and pushes forward this idea, this kind of camouflage vests and jackbooted idea of masculinity that the younger men especially eat up. And even at the macro level, as you know, my big macro statistics things, even at the macro level, every single one of these, as they started to collapse, the first indicator was a decline in equality. And by that, I mean group inequality like women. And women is the most important indicator only because, well, for several reasons, but in any case, they're the biggest.
Yeah.
These things worry me. This happens so consistently. And if you go back in history, you look at Mussolini, you look at Hitler, you look at Franco, you're going to find that same thing. So I am worried right now that even if they can recruit even a small number of men, when we're in such a polarized situation, it doesn't take much change at the margin to go in the wrong direction. And I think an example of that, of course, is the young men voting for Trump in this last election who were recruited out of that manosphere kind of ethic.
Yeah.
As a straightforward policy matter, the thing that worried me the most was the dissolution of DEI. Those affirmative action provisions were really important to the strides that were made, and they were never about advantaging men. They were always about correcting for past inequality that was still impinging on the present. And so having that just be ripped away like that, I mean, I'm just
trashed.
And the thing is that it was vulnerable. That it was an executive order in the first place. It was the Lyndon Johnson order that had been amended and added to quite a lot by Richard Nixon. But when it's an executive order, all it takes is for the next executive to rip it up.
Yeah. I wanted to jump back for a second to an earlier point, which is actually sort of related to the Trump administration in particular and the embroilment of the Epstein files and what's coming to light with that. One of the main mechanism of excluding women so effectively from economy is sexual violence. threat of sexual violence. And you say, where you write about that, only women that are economically empowered can say no to sex. And that, again, just another mind-blowing line where you're just like, yes, of course that's the case. And that is so much a crux of the whole, what the leverages are.
Yeah. And from what I have read, Epstein's strategy and Maxwell's strategy was to prey on economically vulnerable girls.
Yeah.
Vulnerable girls, but from the stories I've seen, almost all of them that I've read were economically vulnerable. And this is a worldwide pattern on slavery, is especially female slavery, which is, of course, most slavery, is that it's economically vulnerable. And because the traffickers know to look for that, they look for that vulnerability and also the absence of somebody who's going to miss them or look after them.
Stand up for them. Yeah.
It's horrible. I mean, it just makes me so sick. It made me so sick from the first time I heard about it, because it is basically, we like to think we don't do that slavery thing, right, in this country.
That's right.
But this is basically sex slavery. It's horrifying in itself, and it's horrifying to find it in a developed country that is so educated and so wealthy and so everything.
In the truly modern era.
Yes, modern era. Yes, and today. I mean, it's just appalling.
But what you talk about in your book is like how far back this is, and it's a key part of patriarchy.
Yeah.
And so that's how I feel we need to look at this phenomena, in that when we look at Epstein and the global network that he employed of men, etc., that trade in women for sexual exploitation is as old as humanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. And it just has been everywhere. As I make the point in the book, you can find it in the world religions, the sacred scriptures even. You find it in fairy tales. You know, the king gives his youngest daughter to this perfect stranger in marriage if he'll kill the dragon. I mean, it's all that. And so it was obviously felt as very normal. Recently, I've been doing some recent historical work for a couple of reasons. It's a class I'm teaching at Brown, but I'm also going to be debating at Cambridge next week. And I've been doing some historical work around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was made after the Second World War. And it's amazing that there were 30 rights enumerated, 30 articles in it, and almost none of those rights were held by married women in countries under the British common law system at the time. That was more than a third of the world population and about half of the nations that were members of the United Nations at that time. And it all came down to a system of laws that declared women not to have their own identity, that they were not persons. And this is it. And they were not persons because they basically belonged to their husbands. And they were so thoroughly under his control that it basically took away their human rights. So this is current history. They didn't take away the marital rape exception until the 1990s in this country, in Canada, in the UK. I mean, how much more dehumanized can you be?
And I mean, for all intents and purposes, rape is just not criminalized.
I mean, it's not, well, look again, back to Epstein, you know?
Yeah.
I think if it gets pushed to the logical end, they're going to find that FBI has a lot of blame to carry on this.
Yeah.
That's my suspicion. But you can see where, just like in developing countries, the authorities are kind of in cahoots. You know, they look the other way. Sometimes they're taking bribes.
And this whole, cover of like modeling agencies to move young girls around the globe under the cover of modeling agencies. So clever. But one of the things you say about the trade in women is that, we hear about it in terms of like an economic phenomena and how men have done it and do it. But we don't talk much up until very recently, because we're hearing from the Epstein victims how the devastation and the damage that it causes to women, like it is life destroying.
And like you say, this is one of the things that just doesn't seem to get through to the men.
Yeah.
I remember during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, that the thing that finally swayed one of the Republican congressmen was that a bunch of victims got in the elevator with him and just said, "Do we not count?" I mean, why didn't he know that already?
Talk about a blind spot. It's just incredibly frustrating to not get any sort of purchase with men when it comes to sexual violence.
Yeah.
You wonder, what is it that we have to say? What is it that we have to express for you to care?
Right. But then again, some hope. The last couple of days, some polls have come out. We're hearing all about how Gen Z men are, becoming would-be patriarchs. But although I have to say that I just really don't think there's data for that. But apparently the thing that is at the top of young men's dissatisfactions with Trump is the Epstein thing. That the number one thing is the affordability, but just a percentage point behind it is Epstein. And so I think that's a really good sign. It has taken generations, right? But the message is getting through. And I have a lot of hope for that. I don't believe that the young men are as bad as they're saying in the press. I just don't think the numbers are there. I'm still teaching, and so I don't see it. So
you meet young men every day in your profession. Yeah.
And I haven't seen it. And I think it's a very small and even local group. So yeah.
That's interesting also that look at how much damage one man, Trump, has made. How little is needed to, and you talk about this in terms of kind of testosterone chain reaction in aggressive workplaces with male aggression. Can you talk a little bit about that? How little is needed for things to go awry in a way?
You can identify among Gen Z men, it's only 18%, a small number of men who identify with traditional masculinity as defined as, stoicism, dominance, all of that. And when you look into the behaviors of men like that, it's very, very, very negative. They have higher incidences of drug abuse. They have higher incidences of divorce. They join terrorist groups more often. They're Hell's Angels more often. They end up in prison more often. It's a really, really negative thing. But what apparently happens, and this is documented in research, and I feel like I've seen it in real life, is that in spite of how weird these guys are, or maybe even because of how weird they are able to have influence over reasonable men. In part because what they are really are bullies. And so they bully the other men. And other men just kind of go, okay, I'm not going to get in a fight over this. But they need to be supported to get in the fight. That's a really important, I think, step for the future. Because what these guys do is they invoke the brotherhood. They say, well, we're men and and you got to be manly here and da-da-da. And most men have some kind of vulnerability on that idea that you've got to perform masculinity every day. So they're vulnerable. And it has a group dynamic that causes, I think the failure of women to advance in work is largely caused by that. Because as higher you get up in a company, the more the decision makers are groups of men. And it becomes, I think, very difficult for a more reasonable man to say, hey, let's be reasonable.
This group dynamic that one, of course, serves to exclude women in the workplace and in places that are male-dominated more so than any other. Yeah.
Yeah. And the more male domination there is in terms of sheer numbers, okay, in a group, in an organization, the worse that's going to be. The worse it's all going to be because it has this critical threshold and they feed on each other. And their environments turn toxic for everybody. It creates a lot of workplace intimidation, a lot of top-down decision-making, and it's not good for anybody. All this stuff needs to just be over.
Yeah, yeah. I'm trying to remember what you say about these people try to import women to mitigate the toxic environment, but the environment is so toxic that women won't stay.
But the toxic environment is why the women aren't there. Yes, exactly. And I've seen that a lot. That was a problem in business schools for decades. And you kind of turn around it now and say, okay, so these incel guys and so forth, they think, they're mad because they can't get dates. They hate women because they can't get dates, and never stop to think about it that it may be that they can't get dates because they hate women. That nobody wants to go out with them because they're the way they are. And so it has that same kind of circular logic to it.
Just like the self-defeating circle. Yeah.
Yeah.
I read your review of the book Sex and War by Malcolm Potts and Thomas Hayden, and I haven't read the book, but I'm familiar with the concept and I'm going to read it. But this idea that, historically, again, like zoom out, this idea that we've been living in a warrior economy, as you say, for hundreds of thousands of years, and that aggressive males have had an advantage in their, mate choice for that long. And so that has kind of affected the human population on a DNA level. If you can talk about what they say and what your response to that is.
Yeah, that was a real eureka moment for me when that book came out. I was reading it as an audio book in a Jeep riding across rural Africa. And I kept going, oh my God, yes, because there was so much that helped me break through the thinking I was doing about the economy. It was also at the same time really scary because they do make pretty universal arguments. It's pretty dead end in a way. And the solution that they find is just basically to give the world to women, which, we need some steps in between that.
Yeah.
And I also think that we should not lionize women quite so much. It's not going to be as simple as that. Anyway, it was very good, and it is affecting my thinking even now. It was so well argued. It was so, starting with one of them had been a doctor in Bangladesh and had administered to rape victims there after that war and everything. That was really heartrending, and it really brought you into the topic. I just thought it was brilliantly done. It alerted me to the importance of the question of war rape, which we treat as an aberration, but is actually the pattern. And it was very important for me. I do want to say that actually some of that argument is now completely out of date. And that is because they focus on the chimpanzees as the only base for human development, the only comparator. And we now know, of course, that there's another one that is equally closely related to us that is female dominant. And that really opens up a lot. And there's been a lot of research, not only since Potts and Hayden wrote, but since Double X Economy came out, about those differences and how those get played out in those two species and what it means for things like food access and stuff. It's fascinating. And so I think we need to stop buying into the stuff that people will say about, well, we're just like chimps and that's why we're so militaristic and everything. Not true. We are also like bonobos and they're just as close to us. So,
And also we have choice. We have choice as human beings. We have agency. We have choice. We're not just choices have been made all along the way. We can actually self-direct. We're not just a product of evolution, I want to say.
Right. And that's one of the main points, of course, of Double X Economy, is that one of the most important adaptive traits, maybe the most important adaptive trait of Homo sapiens, is that we can look around and know when we're in trouble. And then we can figure out what's causing it and make a plan and execute it, right? So if we're in trouble, and we are with this patriarchy thing, there's no reason all we need is the will. This is why it's so important to emphasize the variability, because that indicates the flexibility. But also this new stuff that I've been reading about, there's a different data set now, a more extensive data set in archaeology, that you can look for the emergence of organized violence. And it doesn't show up until right before agriculture appears. And we'd been around for couple, 100,000 years or more by that time. And
Yeah.
it really does look like we were not violent before that. And
Mm.
so what archaeologists have made, comments for years about, well, humans just took this weird little turn in the evolutionary path. And isn't that too bad? Well, in a way, we weren't born that way. We didn't get up that way this morning. So we can make that choice. We just need to want to make it.
Yeah. And when you say we weren't violent, are you making a distinction between organized violence and personal violence?
Mostly what they're looking for is evidence of group violence, multi-person violence. And that would count as, some people call it male coalitionary violence, which is basically what I'm calling organized violence because it's a group and everybody has to have a strategy. And that doesn't show up till pretty late.
Yeah.
They're always telling us that in the whole of human history, we're just the last 5 minutes or whatever. I mean, there's a very long time in there where we weren't warmongers. So it's doable. It is doable. We can do this. And we even have a pretty good idea of knowing what we should do, how we need to change. And yeah, it's just a matter of the will.
The will. Right now, it seems not hopeless, I shouldn't say, but like there's a lot of drumming of war drums, and there's a lot of chest thumping and a lot of domination talk, and women should be used for breeding and all of this kind of stuff. That's really frightening to women all over the globe.
And that's classic patriarchy. I mean, that combination of militarism and assertion of dominance and demeaning women, all of that, we've been doing that not our whole species life, but a long time. And it's classic. And so we should have been taught somewhere along the line to recognize those signs. The problem is that people just haven't been looking at global systems from a gender point of view, which is too bad. Or at least not with any data, but we just didn't have much data. But we have enough now to know what needs to be done. But I think we're in a very dangerous moment. And it gets back to this thing I'm talking about of it doesn't take much shift on the margins to make everything go down. There are international institutions that track democracies, how solid their democracy is, whether they're about to collapse into autocracy. And we are very much on the backside. I mean, just not opinion, but people out there with systemic ways of measuring that, we are on the backside. So it's dangerous. It's very dangerous.
Yeah. I mean, I feel it. I'm on the edge of my seat. I wake up in the morning and feel the tension.
Yeah, I mean, I do too. And I was like The Handmaid's Tale. Some people didn't want to believe that was a possibility. That is, I felt like at the time, because this is another one of the lessons from world history, is that women have broken through before. And it has lasted longer, even. And it's always temporary. There's always backsliding, has been, and it is always a sudden regime change. So there we are.
Yeah. Always temporary. That sounds like a curse.
Always temporary and always sudden. And you think about things like the revolution in Iran in 1979. I mean, those women were super westernized, and overnight they were covered up. It can happen fast.
Exactly. And in this latest Saving America by Saving the Family document that the regime published, they named Hungary as a shining example to follow, talking about fast. In only like 15 years or so, they have turned ultra patriarchal and reversed all kinds of women's rights.
And this is one of the things I'm arguing in my new book, is that we need to be watching those things because the decline in women's rights goes first. And you could measure that decline in Hungary and Russia a good 8 years ago.
Yeah.
You could measure it. And, what are we doing not caring about this? It is clearly determinative, on a global scale. So, but yeah, you're right. It's very negative, and it's very much a long-standing pattern. And right now, it's worldwide.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you about your new book. What is this new project?
So when I was writing Double X Economy, and this was already starting to, even before I started, starting to occur to me that this business about the benefits only happened because the constraints were harmful. And they're so consistent that you have to start thinking about if you really want to solve it, because I'm a firm believer and you need to know the history of a problem in order to solve it. So if you start looking for that source, it's huge. It has to be huge because there's so much consistency, and it has to be pretty sinister. So I wanted to write a book, and especially now that everything's turned so dark, I wanted to write a book on the harms. And so that, for example, the patriarchal practices cause hunger, for example, which you can absolutely show. You can show that when patriarchal attitudes go up, the Human Development Index goes down. And the data is stark. It's stark. And so I thought, all right, let's do this. And so that's why I'm digging back into the origins of patriarchy, because I'm going to make the argument that this is our oldest social structure and it is a problem. And so that's what it's about. And it's going to look at the health impact, the mental health impact, the environmental impact. It's all negative. And then the enabling institutions and the enabling philosophies. So it sounds like a lot. I know that, but I've already got a really detailed outline, and I
Wow.
know I can do it in book length and make it readable. I'm just sure about that.
Do you have a title for it yet? Is this the XY economy?
No, no. This is still a working title. All right. And you can see what I'm going for here. It's pretty shocking. I'd like to think big. The title is The Knife at Our Throats: How Patriarchy Drives Global Breakdown.
Wow. Well, I would love to have you back to talk about that when it's out. I mean,
Sure. I'd love to do it.
that's amazing. We need clarity. We need big picture view.
Yeah. And I think we need the big picture because it's long overdue. I mean, this is half the population, for crying out loud. You don't think there's a system impact from that? Crazy. But also because of this information gap that you and I've come back to several times in this conversation, where these man groups are coming out and saying these things that have no basis in fact. But the other side doesn't have the data. That gap has to be filled. This is one of the reasons why I changed my class, because my class last year started right after Trump was inaugurated, and my students were just frightened, but they didn't really know what was happening to them because they'd never been taught the background of any of this.
Yeah.
And I felt like I needed to teach them. So this year we're focusing on the US, and we're talking about the trends of the last 75 years and the chimps and the bonobos and all the Neanderthals and everybody. And I'm amazed. I mean, they're really smart young women. They're all women there, but they don't know. And I see them on TikTok, the young women just trying so hard to grapple with this. And obviously there's so much tension around it. But the problem is that people don't have the data. For this Cambridge thing that I'm going to do next week, one of the contentions is that there's this male mental health crisis, right? And everywhere you see people say, oh, it's because men don't know how to be men anymore, which is just, I mean, please. But the assumption is always, well, what they need to do is they need to reestablish traditional masculinity so they can act like real men now. But the data shows that actually traditional masculinity can't be the solution because it is the cause. And so, no, but I don't understand why people aren't talking about that, because there's the American Psychological Association has a counterpart in every major country, and all of them have this finding. We just don't hear it. We just hear, I think the liberal media is just as guilty as anyone else of pushing this narrative about crisis of masculinity. I think it must get a lot of clicks. The other thing is you can document that the approval of traditional masculinity by men has gone down with each generation since the war, where we now have 18% of Gen Z men saying they like that idea. And so what you then necessarily have is a growing group of men at the same time who don't endorse traditional masculinity. So what do they endorse? And people want to say, well, they're just They're flailing, they're not real men. But what the data shows is something entirely different. It shows that there is a coherent ideal of masculinity that is more forward-facing, and it has been growing for years. And you can measure its outcomes just like you can measure traditional masculinity outcomes, and they're very good for the men, for their partners, for their children, and for their communities. And so it's something really rather magnificent that's happening, but we're being told they're not real men anymore. It's
Right. And when you say forward-facing masculinity, are you talking about like these are men that like care about human things?
Yeah, so there's a couple of, and I'm still zeroing in on these, but I would say that the main axis of difference is for traditional masculinity, the core attribute that just drives everything is dominance. And I think it's the core attribute of this new one is egalitarianism. There's a difference in, for example, the willingness to use violence. Under traditional masculinity, the man is even supposed to use it to advance his own agenda. All right. Grievances. All right. That's where you get, we had a shooting at Brown here over Christmas, and you get that kind of thing. But the new masculinity only uses violence to stop harm, to protect other people. That's the only way that is acceptable. That's a giant difference. That's the difference between criminality and heroism.
Yeah, huge.
So, yeah, humane and more willing to share all kinds of stuff.
That's hopeful news.
Well, it is. It is hopeful, but gosh, why are we not reading about it,
Yes. Why isn't that on every page? The new masculinity.
No, instead, all the men have gone to hell. I tell you what, if I were a man right now, I'd be real insulted by being told that I'm not a real man anymore. I would just take exception to that in a big way.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. This was a fantastic conversation, and real honor to speak with you and hear about your work and thinking and everything else. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Subject to Power. You can find the show online at subjecttopower.com or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love to know your thoughts on these conversations, so please drop a note on the website or find us on social media. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Subject to Power on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other listeners find us. Subject to Power is written, hosted, and produced by me, El Kamihira. Audio engineering is done by Jason Sheasley at Abridged Audio. Cover art by B. Johnson, and music by Beware of Darkness.